dismisses.
Good evening, learners, and welcome to today's session. The session is titled Reading D.H. Lawrence's novel Sons and Lovers, Part 2. This is a session for students of BA English Honours. The course is British Literature, Early 20th Century, and the course code is BEGC 112. I am Dr. Malathy A, and I coordinate this course. As you know, this is a course about, as the title itself suggests, about British literature of the early 20th century. This was a very significant period in the history of British literature. It was a time when British writing was breaking away from the 19th century style of writing and finding a new kind of voice. And in this course, we begin the course by discussing literary concepts, terms, etc., such as modernism and how modernism is different from postmodernism, how modernism differed from the writing of the 19th century that came before it. And after defining these fundamental terms and concepts, we move on to a study of some key writings of this period, such as D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and some of the finest writings of poets like W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, Stephen Spender, etc. Today we will be focusing on one of these texts, that is Sons and Lovers. In a previous session, we had attempted to contextualize Sons and Lovers within D.H. Lawrence's writing, as well as within early 20th century British fiction as a whole. We saw how Lawrence was a figure who practically dominated early 20th century British writing. He tried a hand at practically every genre of writing, whether it was poetry, novels, short stories, essays, travel writing. He was one of the greatest travel writers of the 20th century, in fact. He was constantly traveling, and he put all those experiences into his writing. In fact, many of his fictional writings, many of his poems also have this travel motive, especially towards the later period. So today we will be discussing Sons and Lovers, which is the text prescribed for you in your course of study. As we have already discussed, this is one of D.H. Lawrence's early novels. In our previous discussion, we had gone through some important aspects of Lawrence's life and the other biographical details, so I don't think we need to go into that right now. Let us go straight to the novel. This is how the novel begins. The Bottoms succeeded to Hell Row. Hell Row was a block of thatched, bulging cottages that stood by the brookside on Greenhill Lane. there lived the colliers who worked in the little gin pits 2 fields away. The brook ran under the alder trees, scarcely soiled by these small mines, whose coal was drawn to the surface by donkeys that plodded wearily in a circle round a gin. And all over the countryside were these same pits, some of which had been worked in the time of Charles II, the few colliers and the donkeys burrowing down like ants into the earth, making queer mounds and little black places among the cornfields and the meadows. So this is the classic beginning of one of the classic novels of the early 20th century. Here, it is written in the familiar style of the realist novel, in the style of novelists like Charles Dickens or Thackeray or any of the great realists of the Victorian period. But almost immediately after this picture of a very restful landscape, the reader is given practically a jolt and jolted into the ugliness. From a landscape that had been unchanging for centuries, we are jolted into the realities of industrial capitalism. So it is this, and this sets the tone for a masterly narrative of social transition. In fact, the very first paragraphs set this tone of transition, and it is within this changing landscape, within a changing social reality, that all the lives of the people whom Lawrence will be talking about later on are situated. So here, what Lawrence does is he actually foregrounds the background. He shows how important this background and the changes that are going on, the subtle changes that are going on in the background, are for the action of the novel, for what happens later. And then let's look at the next passage. Then, some 60 years ago, a sudden change took place. The gin pits were elbowed aside by the large mines of the financiers. The coal and iron field of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire was discovered. Amid tremendous excitement, Lord Palmerston formally opened the company's first mine at Spinney Park on the edge of Sherwood Forest. So Sherwood Forest is a name that evokes memories of Robin Hood and his band, of medieval values, of a pristine forest, and on the edge of that forest you have this great encroachment of ugly modern industrial capitalism. So it is through these little contrasts that Lawrence creates this sense of transition right at the beginning of the novel. So this is how we begin Sons and Lovers. This was Lawrence's first great novel. He had written 2 novels earlier, The White Peacock and The Trespasser, which were more in a romantic, a more poetic kind of writing. And it was here that, it was with Sons and Lovers that Lawrence actually found his voice. He had been encouraged by some other writers, by editors, to write about the mining landscape from which he came. So when Lawrence first started writing, he was very conscious of the fact that he came from a working class background and was not sure whether he would be accepted by the intelligentsia, by the great critics of the London Circle. But very soon some of these critics realized that this young man coming from a working class colliery background had something new to say, had a new kind of experience to present before the English readers. And they encouraged him to start looking towards his own community, his own people, his own social background to write about. And that is how, during this period, Lawrence started writing about the mining region, the Nottinghamshire mining region, and the mining families that he knew so well. And that was how Sons and Lovers came into existence. It was Lawrence himself knew that Sons and Lovers was his first great achievement. It was the novel that made him a popular writer for the first time. even though Lawrence himself thought of other novels such as The Rainbow as his favorite novels, this was definitely the novel that placed him on a certain pedestal. It was the novel that gave him the kind of acceptance that made F.R. Lewis remark that Lawrence belonged to the great tradition of the British novel. So it was published exactly almost a century ago in 1913. And it was one of, as I said, it was one of his early masterpieces. It is now a regular presence on the syllabi of English literature students everywhere, including India. For many people, it is one of the only novels by Lawrence that they have read. It is one of the first novels that they read, and very often the only one. And even today, it finds there are enthusiastic readers of this novel. Several film versions have been made. So how does Lawrence speak to us across generations, across this gap of a century? How does this novel still continue to absorb us? In what way does it sustain our interest? That is what I would like to examine in this very short period of time that we have. So as pointed out by Helen and Carl Barron in their introduction to the Penguin edition of Sons and Lovers, which is perhaps the most authoritative edition, which follows the Cambridge University Press edition. Sons and Lovers, I quote, has received a great deal of critical attention, but it resists being pinned down to any single diagnostic account. It has been described in a variety of ways as a record of working class life, a successful exercise in self-analysis, an illustration of one or another psychoanalytical theory, an exploration of admirable role models for 20th century men and women, a critique of industrial capitalism, an example of powerful realism, etc., etc. So it is clear that this is a novel. If you have read the novel, which I hope you have, please do read the entire novel. It's very, very readable. And unlike many of Lawrence's later novels, which are fairly difficult, this is written in a straightforward, simple style, and it is very readable. So do read the novel before you take your exams. And if you have read the novel, you would have noticed that it is multi-layered. There are several layers within the novel. Though, as I said at the beginning, though it begins in the straightforward style of the realist, as we go on, we realize that there are several layers within the novel, all of which are deeply interconnected and woven together very, very skillfully. And what are these different layers? Let us look at some of these. One is the autobiographical element. Very obviously, the novel draws upon some aspects of Lawrence's own experience in growing up in the English East Midlands. Then the formal elements, the way the tensions between the realist and the more symbolist kind of writing within the novel. We will speak about that later. Then the characterization, the superb, the extremely clever characterization. Many of the characters are very loosely based on people in Lawrence's own family, as well as his friends and other relatives. Then the way Lawrence writes the natural world. Lawrence was someone who was extremely sensitive to the natural world, and some of his best writings can be found here. Then the way he writes the East Midlands into this novel, because this is often spoken of as a classic regional novel of the English East Midlands. Then, as I said, the critique of industrialization. This critique, Lawrence begins here, and he continues it in novels like The Rainbow and Women in Love. So this is a persistent theme in Lawrence. And in those novels, you find it being it is done at a much more interior. There is a more interiorized style of writing in those novels. Then the Oedipal theme and the startling similarity with the kind of themes that Sigmund Freud was talking about almost at the same time. So these are some aspects that make the novel very interesting to us even today, and which is probably why it has so many readers and so many enthusiastic admirers even a century after its publication. It had a very interesting publishing history. The novel was written, as I said, it was published in 1913, but Lawrence began writing the novel in 1910. And this was a very intense and very difficult time in his life. It was the time when his mother became seriously ill and passed away. His relationships with his childhood friend Jessie Chambers were breaking up during this time. And he began his scandalous relationship with Frida Weekly, whom he later married around this time. So it was a fairly difficult and complicated time in his life. And Lawrence wrote several drafts of the novel. And he wrote, rewrote, revised, re-revised, and this was his habit. He was someone who worked continuously on his drafts before publishing them. And he then sent the draft to Duckworth Publishers, and Edward Garnett, the editor at Duckworth, actually took away major chunks of the novel because he found them obscene. So many critics have criticized Garnett for doing this, saying that Garnett had seriously interfered in the writing of this great creative writer. But if Garnett had not done that, maybe the novel would never have been published. Anyway, from 1913 till 1992, it was this edited version that was available to readers. It was in 1992 that the Cambridge University Press brought out an edition of which brought back all the sections that had been cut out by Garnett. So the first complete edition, in fact, was brought out in 1992, which is now easily available to all of us. So something very, very significant about Sons and Lovers was, perhaps for the first time in the history of English literature, the working class life was brought into focus. So as Terry Eagleton points out, now the working class is, you get a sense of the working class from within, where they are not spoken of as objects, but they become the subjects. And this was something very refreshingly new about this novel. And you get a sense of the drudgery of their daily lives, how precarious the lives of the English industrial working class, especially the miners, was during this time. So Lawrence was definitely drawing upon the life of his own father, who was a miner at Brinsley Colliery near Eastwood. And it was the character Walter Morrell is very loosely based on Lawrence's own father. And here we find the sense of the difficulties of life in the mining pit, and the monotony of their living spaces. So the kind of standardized housing that the mining companies created in Bestwood, and how they were very convenient and fairly decent, as Lawrence says, but they were very monotonous. And the sense of the drudgery and the monotony of their lives is brought about here. And what is interesting is that though Lawrence begins to write a novel about the mining community, it is actually the basic theme of the novel, when you read it seriously, you find is an effort to escape from the mining community and to move up to a more respectable bourgeois existence. So it is this aspiration. So Lawrence's own mother, this aspect again comes from Lawrence's own life, because his mother was a fairly well-educated woman who was married to a miner, and she found the life of the mining community around her so rough and unrefined that she was constantly goading her own sons to move through education to a different level of existence. And you find the same reflected in the novel as well. So a very crucial theme of Sons and Lovers is this desire for mobility, social mobility, and the desire for the aspiration to move to something more respectable. So in a way, it is a novel about the mining community that avoids mining. That is why Terry Eagleton says that mining, the character Walter Morrell is an absence in the novel, because the kind of life, the kind of work that he represents is something that the rest of the family wishes to avoid. So even though it is a novel about mining, you find that the whole purpose of the novel is to move away from the world of mining towards a different kind of life. Then, as I said, the novel is clearly autobiographical. There is so this is again another aspect about the novel that has been debated from the time the novel was published. How autobiographical is Sons and Lovers? Did Lawrence set out to write a very straightforwardly autobiographical novel? So it very clearly reflects the life of Lawrence's own Nottinghamshire background, the conflicts within his own family, the kind of divisions that were there, and the kind of difficult relationships that existed within his parents and the children. So these kinds of tensions you find, the kinds of frustrations you find reflected in Sons and Lovers as well. And many of the characters are also quite very loosely modeled on Lawrence's own family members, but it is definitely not a straightforwardly autobiographical novel. To do that, in spite of, we should not miss the clear departures that Lawrence makes from his own life experiences. And this he does by bringing in several narrative voices so that the central theme is generalized rather than personalized. So even though there are several autobiographical elements, it is not a straightforwardly autobiographical novel. It is not pure and simple autobiography. It is much more complex than that. And Lawrence was very clearly making significant departures from his own life. In fact, in many senses, he was experimenting with what might have been in his own life. By making Paul Morrell the central character, an artist, he was kind of trying to see what would have happened if he himself had become an artist rather than a writer. So there are very significant changes from the events in Lawrence's own life here. Then we spoke about how there are the formal elements. If you consider the formal elements of the novel, you find within the novel itself a tension between the earlier 19th century style of realist writing and the more modernist kind of writing which became prominent in the early 20th century. Within the novel itself, you can see this kind of tension between two styles of writing. Lawrence used realism in order to present the social realities around him, but he uses a more metaphorical kind of imaginative writing, a more symbolic kind of writing to represent the inner lives of the people that the very subtle aspects of their inner lives, these are brought about in a highly metaphorical language. So that way it is a very interesting to see how there is this kind of tension within formally itself within the novel. When you come to the other novels, when you come to Lawrence's next novel, such as The Rainbow, or even to Women in Love, you find that he had almost completely broken away from the realist style. And that breaking away, you can actually see that happening in Sons and Lovers. Sons and Lovers is sometimes considered as a Bildungsroman, what you call a growing up novel, because it is about a character growing up and developing. And it's also in the story of an artist, as the development of an artist, the kind of theme you find in James Joyce. But here Lawrence uses those conventions in a to experiment with new ways of representing character. So these are some aspects of Sons and Lovers that you should look at in detail while you are studying the novel. This is a novel that has been researched a lot, so a lot of critical material is available. The reading lists are available in your study material itself. So do try to look up some of these critical works. And also there are several film versions of the novel available. Do try to watch some of those. And I hope you really enjoy studying this novel. That is, enjoy reading and studying this novel. All the best, and thank you.